Welcome back. The history of the Jews in Poland dates back over 800 years. For centuries, Poland was home to the largest and most significant Jewish community in the world. It was the center of Jewish culture, thanks to a long period of statutory religious tolerance and social autonomy. But this ended with the partition of Poland, which began in 1772, in particular with the discrimination and persecution of Jews in the Russian Empire. Today, Hugh Reichland tells us more in our series, Heritage Travels.
Jews came to Poland for the first time in the year 1100. And in fact, there are records of Jews having worked in the Polish mint in the 1100s, and there are Hebrew inscriptions in some of those early coins still from that period. In 1330, Casimir the Great came out with edicts and charters protecting the Jewish people. And for many hundreds of years, the Jews lived in relative tranquility in Poland. There were cases of anti-Semitic riots in the 1400s, but there was calm, and for many, many years, Jews thrived in Poland to the extent that just before World War II, there were approximately 3.3 million Jewish people in Poland. In Warsaw itself, approximately 1/3 of the population of Warsaw before 1939, just before 1939, were Jewish people. And there's a street in Warsaw to this day that is called Jeruzalemska Street, Jerusalem Street in Poland. There is only, unfortunately, one synagogue that is operating in Poland today, and that is the Nozyk Shul. I was privileged to participate in one of the prayer services at that particular synagogue. And we were told that the only reason that that particular synagogue has survived in Warsaw is because the Nazis used that building to house their horses as a stable during World War II. When we went to Krakow, another large and famous city of Poland, we saw the synagogue of the Rav Moshe Isserles, that lived in Krakow from 1525 till about 1575, and he was one of the most famous Polish Jews. The Jewish book of law is known as the Shulchan Aruch, and that is the seminal work which sets out all the laws, all the Jewish laws of observance of the Jewish people. It was written by Rav Yosef Karo, Rabbi Joseph Karo, who was originally from Spain and emigrated to Israel. But the text of that particular work was aimed at the Jews of the Middle East and of Israel. Rav Moshe Isserles, who was in Krakow, he wrote the commentary for the Ashkenazi Jews. Those are the Central European and Eastern European Jews. And the two of them were writing almost at the same time in the 1500s, and they didn't know what the other was doing. And when Rabbi Moshe Isserles found out that his colleague in Israel had written the same work, there was no ego in it whatsoever. He simply accepted what Rabbi Karo had done in Israel, in the town called Tzfat, in the north of Israel, and he said all that he will do is he will add in a gloss where the East European Jews, where our traditions differ from the Middle Eastern Jews, but he did away with his work, so to speak, and only kept it as a commentary of the main work. In Poland, there was a very famous rabbi by the name of Rabbi Meir Shapiro, and he lived in the city of Lublin. And he was born in 1887 and he died in 1933, a relatively young man in his late 40s. And he instituted a system of learning that is still perpetuated in the world today. It was called the Daf Yomi program. Now, the book of Jewish law and ethics and morality, known as the Talmud, has several volumes, in fact many volumes, that have been recorded over the last 2,000 years. And they worked out that if you studied 1 page a day, it would take one person approximately 7.5 years to cover the entire spectrum of the Talmud, which, as I said, is this book of Jewish law, ethics, morality, and history. And There are many tens of thousands of people that are on the program today, and in fact, I am presently on that program and have been learning for about 2.5 years, and hope also within that 7.5 year period to cover the entire Talmud. And that was a major step that was taken by Rabbi Meir Shapiro that has had a huge effect on Jewry to this very day. There was also a very famous rabbi that lived in Poland, and his name was Rabbi Meir Kagan, Yisrael Meir Kagan, also known as the Chofetz Chaim, and he was also one of the most famous Jews of the early 20th century. And he left a number of works that have had a major influence on the Jewish community of the world today. And he was born in Poland and later moved to Lithuania. When we were in Poland, we also went to Auschwitz, which was the largest of the death camps of the Nazis. And we know that Poland surrendered to the Nazis on the 1st of September 1939. And they then implemented what we know today as the Holocaust, which really started with isolation, where they stripped Jews of their human rights. People lost their jobs, they couldn't attend school. Then there was ghettoization, which was the second phase, where Jews were forced to live in confined quarters, like the ghetto in Lodz, for example, in another city in Poland. And then finally, elimination, which was the movement of Jews from the ghetto. And there were also Jews taken from many other ghettos throughout Poland to Auschwitz. And we brought a candle with us from a man by the name of Reuven Ziegelboim. And he was an actor, and he was part of the Yiddish theater of Poland. And he had a brother who was very famous in the time of the Holocaust, and his name was Shmuel Ziegelboim. And Shmuel Ziegelboim was a person that he got smuggled out of Poland. Reuven Ziegelboim gave one of the persons that came with us from South Africa on our trip what we call a Yortzeit candle, which is a memorial candle that we lit in Auschwitz in memory of Shmuel Ziegelboim, his brother. And as we were saying, Shmuel Ziegelboim smuggled out of Poland, and he went to England, and he tried to raise awareness of world Jewry as to what was happening in Poland. And he spoke at several places publicly, and he just felt that people were not believing what he was saying. In fact, it was very difficult in defense of those Jews that did hear Shmuel Ziegelboim. It was very difficult for them to comprehend that the Nazis, in fact, were implementing the final solution, and that millions of Jews were going to be killed in the Nazi death camps. And eventually Shmuel Ziegelboim became so desperate that people were not hearing his message, and that he wasn't able to galvanize support of the world and the Allied forces to go into Poland and other parts of occupied Europe and save the Jews, that he took his own life in a hotel in London. And he left a note that if people aren't taking him seriously, maybe this final act of his will wake up the world to the atrocities that were going on in Poland. When we were in Warsaw, we saw the remains of what was the Warsaw Ghetto. And it was a large wall made of brick that still stands. And it's only a piece of the former wall that stood. And the ghetto was a creation of the Nazis in the early 1940s, where they used Jewish slave labor to enclose a portion of Warsaw, where several 100,000 Jews were kept, and many of them died already in Warsaw from disease, starvation, and many other social problems that were caused as a result of living in such close quarters. The Jews of Warsaw were taken to the Treblinka concentration camp. And today there is a memorial in Warsaw near to where the Warsaw Ghetto siding was, the railway siding where the Jews were lined up each morning to be taken to Treblinka, and it's called the Umschlagplatz. And it's a wall made of marble, and there's a black band of marble that goes through the center of this symbol of the Holocaust. And that was the place where the Jews used to line up, and that is there in memory of all the victims. And in fact, they've tried to put as many names as possible of the Jews of the Warsaw Ghetto that traveled their last journey to Treblinka. Their names are recorded at the Umschlagplatz. When we were in Warsaw, we went to a monument to the uprising of the Jews of Warsaw during the time of the Holocaust. And that happened in 1943. It was led by a young man by the name of Mordechai Anilevich. And he led an uprising with a small group of people, and they used the most primitive of weapons. One of the weapons that they developed was the Molotov cocktail, which was essentially a bottle which they filled with fuel, and then they had a wick, and they would throw it at the German forces, and they managed for several weeks to hold off the might of the Third Reich. And this was a symbol of Jewish resistance in the Holocaust, but there was also a spiritual resistance. We mentioned the Warsaw Ghetto, and there are recorded stories of thousands and thousands of Jews that lived in the Warsaw Ghetto in the most horrific conditions, without proper sanitation, without food. And their spiritual resistance was enormous. They would have prayer groups, they would have study groups, there were newspapers, there were people teaching Hebrew, and there were people that still strove under those unbearable, inhumane conditions to keep their sanity, to keep their civilized behavior. There were organizations that were welfare organizations looking after people as best they could with the limited resources that they had, because they valued life and they did everything in order to keep a certain civilized standard of living, even in those appalling conditions of Warsaw. So you had both the physical resistance and you had the spiritual resistance in the Holocaust that we saw being played out in Warsaw and many other parts of Poland. Of the 3.3 million Jews that lived in Poland before the Second World War, 90% of them approximately were murdered by the Nazis and their collaborators in the years 1941 to roughly 1944. Of the 300,000 that survived, many left Eastern Europe and went to Israel and other parts of the world. But the legacy of the Polish Jews certainly carries on to this day. And luminaries, like we mentioned earlier, of Rabbi Moshe Isserlis from the 16th century, Rabbi Meir Shapiro of the late 19th century and 20th century, and the Chofetz Chaim are giants of Jewry that have made an indelible impression on the Jewish people. And we carry the responsibility of Jews of taking their legacy into the future and strengthening and rebuilding after the destruction of the Holocaust and all that the Jews have experienced throughout the centuries. In Krakow, there is also a place called the Kazimierz, and that is a place where a lot of social events take place. And there's an amazing phenomenon that amongst the non-Jewish Polish community, they have an annual music festival where they play the music of the Jewish people that were once in Poland. As we said, there were millions of Jews, and they had an indelible effect on the Polish community. And there is a style of Jewish music called klezmer, and they have a klezmer festival which is attended by literally tens of thousands of Gentiles singing Yiddish songs and Hebrew songs of the Jews of a bygone era. One of those interesting phenomena that we see in the modern world today. Today they say that there are approximately 5,000 to 10,000 Jews in Poland, although I heard from Rabbi Michael Shudrich, who is the chief rabbi of Poland, that he thinks that there could be as many as 40,000 to 50,000 Jews in Poland. However, many of them do not know that they're Jews, because many of them were hidden away as children by their parents amongst their Gentile neighbors. And so they all, although they are biologically Jewish, they don't identify with the Jewish community.